Hello, my name is Jessamy Carlson, and I'm the Family and Local History Engagement Lead at the National Archives here in Kew. This webinar, Top Level Tips Discovering Your Local History at the National Archives, is designed to take you through some of our collections and introduce you to how they might be used to research a particular place. In order to do that, I am firstly going to examine some of the records which the National Archives holds, drawing on a case study based on our collections, and then towards the end of the webinar, I'll also give some examples of books and studies held in the library at the National Archives which may be of use or interest. Most of these are likely to be available in other libraries, especially if they are geographically relevant to the place or community you are interested in learning more about. It is important to note, however, that this webinar does not cover collections which are found in local archives, record offices, or local studies collections. So why might you be interested in learning more about local history? Perhaps you've uncovered some relatives in a part of the country or the world that you're not familiar with. Perhaps a recent anniversary or event has piqued your interest in a period of history, and you want to know how the area you live in responded to those events, or what it looked like then. Perhaps there's a house or a church or a park near to you, and you've always idly wondered why it's there or who built it, and here's an opportunity to work it out. Perhaps a small child you're related to has just unveiled their homework or holiday project, and it's all about the history of your local area. Or perhaps you just want to learn something new. There are lots of reasons why you might be interested in local history, and all of them are perfectly valid. Local history is really infinite in terms of what you can do with it. There are so many potential rabbit warrens of research that you might end up going down. So in the first instance, I find it's helpful to set out some parameters for beginning research. Have a clear geographical remit in mind. This will help you rule out more general sources or might help you identify more specific ones. Local history research might be as specific as a street or an electoral ward, or it might be a hamlet or a village or a suburb. Do remember, though, that it is possible that the location of a place may have shifted over time. It's also very helpful to have a sense of what point in time you are interested in. If it's the entire existence of a place, either in summary or in very great detail, then I would suggest that you start with the one-place study, of which more on the next slide. If you are researching a place or a community in England, you might also want to look at the Victoria County history, often known as the VCH, to see if the volume for the pre-1974 county exists or is in progress. Being able to pin something down to a specific time period makes it much easier to work out which records might be the most useful to your research, since records from, for example, the Middle Ages are likely to tell you something potentially very different to the sources one might find for the first half of the 20th century. You might also need a variety of additional skills in order to fully interpret documentary sources prior to the 19th century. Be clear about what it is that you want to find out. In some ways, your motivation or rationale doesn't really matter. Most archivists are delighted to support research. However, having an idea of what it is that you want to learn or investigate helps set a prioritization order for the types of records you might find most helpful. When beginning research into a place, and I mean in the widest possible terms here, I would usually begin by trying to read around it. Obviously, this isn't a requirement, but it can be a good way to get a feel for a place, particularly if you don't live there, or especially if you haven't visited it. One good place to have a quick look is the Society for One-Place Studies. This is a growing field of resources, and if you're lucky enough to have a study for the place you're interested in, then it can be an absolute goldmine of information. You might also consider having a look at the Victoria County history for the area you're researching if it's in England. The VCH, as it's often known, was established in 1899 as a national project to write the history of every county in England, and it's still going strong. The VCH comprises, and I quote, an authoritative encyclopedic history of each county. You may have heard of these referred to as the Red Books, and they are an excellent place to gain a thorough understanding of the place you are interested in from a rigorously historical perspective. If you are researching places outside of England, I would suggest that you start by looking at the websites for the relevant national institutions there. So for Northern Ireland, have a look at the Public Record Office for Northern Ireland, PRONI, in Belfast. And for the Republic of Ireland, I would suggest looking at the National Archives of Ireland in Dublin. If you're researching in Scotland, then the National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh is your go-to. And in Wales, try the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth. The staff in all of these organisations are so knowledgeable and they have extensive resources which will be of use and relevance and interest to you. And if you're really lucky, it might turn out that they have particular local insight or knowledge into a place. I am going to talk you through the types of records held by the National Archives, which you might find useful or interesting if you're going to start a piece of local history research. And in order to do that, I'm going to use an example to illustrate the variety of records available based on the town of Wootton-under-Edge in Gloucestershire. Wootton is a small town located about halfway between Gloucester and Bristol and has its roots in the Anglo-Saxon period. It appears in the Domesday Book in 1086 and it built its wealth in the wool trade. The parish church was consecrated in 1283 and amongst its streets can be found 3 separate and still operational sets of almshouses. Illustrious former residents include Sir Isaac Pitman of shorthand fame and the poet Yue Fanthorpe. And it has a fairly decent array of records to demonstrate how you might construct a piece of research into the town. This webinar is going to deal exclusively with records held in the collections of the National Archives. It obviously follows that you will find extensive and varied collections relating to cities, towns and villages in the local collections, be that the local studies library, the museum, the history centre and or the archives in whatever part of the country you're interested in. And it is definitely worth your while touching base with those services. However, there is potentially a great deal of interesting material to be found at Kew, and that is going to be the focus of today's webinar. Discovery, seen here, is the online catalogue for the National Archives, but it also incorporates online catalogues for a huge number of archives in the UK and indeed around the world. So for today's purposes, I am restricting the search to held by the National Archives only, which you can change in the drop-down box at the bottom on the right-hand side of the screen. I have searched for Wootton-under-Edge, although capitalisation doesn't make much odds in these contexts, and you will notice that I have not restricted the dates here. If you are interested in a particular period in time, you can potentially use these fields to restrict the search to documents that fall between 2 given dates. And if you then click search, your results will be revealed to you. I prefer to sort my results by reference, as I find it easier to get my head around an order rather than using the relevance filter. That's the standard modus operandi for discovery, but it is easy to change using the drop-down menu in the middle of the screen here. If you do want to know more about getting the most out of discovery, there is a webinar available through our YouTube channel which will give you lots of top tips. So discovery shows that there are 802 records relating to Wootton-under-Edge held by the National Archives, and that 347 of these are available to download, which is a great beginning. If you look at the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see that there are a number of drop-down lists including date, collection, subjects. You can also refine your search by catalogue levels, closure status or record opening date, but that probably isn't necessary in these instances. The date field is useful if you're interested in a particular time frame. You can easily refine the records down to those relating to, say, the medieval period or indeed the 20th century, if that's your period of interest. And you can do that by ticking the relevant boxes and then hitting refine. The collection section refers to document classes, and these can be helpful in pulling out types of records to inform your research from our collections. This is a pretty representative sample of what you might find when you begin a piece of research into a place, and I'll briefly talk you through what you might expect to find in broad terms in these types of records. You can, of course, refine the results down to a particular class of records either here or through the advanced search on the catalogue search options. There isn't time today to go into extensive details and lots of examples, so I am going to talk through the types of records you will find in these series and how these might inform a piece of local history research. I'm afraid it hasn't been possible to acquire images from most of these document examples, so please bear with me as I talk you through these record series using the catalogue descriptions. Prob records are records of the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, which dealt with probate records, hence prob. And for Wootton, you will find an array of records dating from 1410, which sets out the disposals of the estates of a variety of residents of the town. These predate 1858 and largely refer to the wealthier residents of the town in this period. This can provide really interesting insight into the lives of some people who lived in the place, though it is important to understand that people leaving a will in pre-1858 eras were in a minority. Their lives, though no doubt fascinating, are not necessarily representative of everyone who lived there at a given point. C refers to the records of the Court of Chancery. The Court of Chancery dealt with a variety of disputes, often but not always related to land. Again, this can provide a really interesting insight into the lives of a certain element of society in a given period, but arguably isn't necessarily representative. ADM refers to records of the Admiralty, and for a landlocked place like Wootton, is unlikely to refer to any Admiralty or naval establishments. It is very likely that the majority of these records refer to men and women in the Royal and Merchant Navies. ED refers to the records of the Education Department, and the majority of the records in this series are likely to be the records of schools, be that actual records kept by particular schools, or possibly reports and inspections of educational establishments in the area. Please bear in mind that many of these may be closed, especially if the children they relate to are likely to be under the age of 100. HO refers to records of the Home Office. In this instance, it's likely that these records relate to prisoners who give Wootton as their home address, or more recently, to individuals living in Wootton who have applied for naturalisation or equivalent provisions. You might also find some of the records of nonconformist churches in this series if you're lucky. MH refers to records of the Ministry of Health and will probably comprise correspondence and reports to and from the General Board of Health, Overseers of the Poor, and other health and social and welfare matters for the 19th century onwards. WO refers to records of the War Office. There haven't been any army bases or equivalent in Wootton. It isn't a town with a strong military association, unlike, say, Wootton Bassett, with which it is occasionally confused. And so it is likely that the majority of records in this series which reference Wootton will be the service records of individuals in the armed forces. In this instance, most likely the army, who gave Wootton as their home address. IR refers to records of the Inland Revenue, and it is likely that the majority of these records comprise the Valuation Office field books and maps, and the tithe apportionments and maps for Wootton, and I'll touch on these in a little more detail later. E refers to the records of the Exchequer. This will likely cover the manorial court records for Wootton and the Domesday Book entries for Wootton. If you're interested in the history of the place in the medieval and early modern period, then the Exchequer records can be an absolute godsend. RG refers to records of the Registrar General and usually comprise record series such as the various censuses. It's very likely that the records you'll find in this type of record are the enumerator's records and or the household schedules, depending on which census it refers to. If you're interested in the geography of a place over time, it is definitely worth having a look at some of the map series we hold at the National Archives. 3 key series are tithe maps and apportionments. Some of these are available online through the Genealogist, which is a subscription website. Some counties also make these available through their own websites, but by no means all. The National Farm Survey, which is useful if you are interested in life at home during the Second World War, and the Valuation Office survey, which was taken just before the 1911 census and gives a different perspective on settlement from that point in time. Each of these and the collective are a really interesting way of learning about a place. These map series can give you a flavour of the types of crops grown on the land, the types of building found there, and the valuation assigned to the land across a range of dates. Of course, there's always the option to review Ordnance Survey maps over the years, which again give you a sense of a place as its population waxes and wanes. There are excellent guides to our map collections on our websites, www.nationalarchives.gov.uk/discovery, and a number of blogs which set out how to use these to their maximum potential, which I would happily recommend. I'm drawing towards the end of this presentation now, but before I finish, I just want to flag some of the collections held in the library at the National Archives, and likely other libraries too, which may be of interest if you're undertaking research into local history. It's always worth looking to see what material has already been published on the area you're interested in. It may be that there are already books on the period and the place you're interested in. Local history or archaeological societies may have published volumes of documents pertinent to the place you're interested in. Lots of places have local studies libraries which may also be able to assist you. And at the National Archives, we're lucky enough to have an extensive collection of books and pamphlets relating to all sorts of places and arranged by county. I've done a search here for Gloucestershire to give you a sense of the scope of our collections, and there's a huge amount of potential reading for someone here on all sorts of topics, and I'd really recommend you have a peruse. If you can't get to the National Archives, do try the local library services or even the copyright libraries such as the British Library, the Cambridge University Library, the Bodleian in Oxford, and so forth, as they may have pertinent volumes which may be of interest. Interlibrary loans can be really helpful here. Other key sources include resources like local newspapers and directories. The British Newspaper Archive is available by subscription online and is well worth a read. It has enormous capacity to lose oneself in for an afternoon and is keyword searchable. This may provide fascinating insight into what was going on in a place at a given point in time, though is largely of use to people researching after the middle of the 19th century, when newspapers expanded both in popularity and reach. You may stumble across absolute gems, such as the fact that an ancestor once won second prize in the village fruitcake competition in the Llanddewi Brefi village fair. You may also want to look at local directories, such as the Kelly's directories, which list a summary about a given place, the tradesmen and women, and details such as the particulars of local train stations and carriage services, and how many pubs were in the place. These can be absolute goldmines of information and are thoroughly fascinating resources for researching the 19th and early 20th century. So thank you for your attention whilst I've gone through this brief introduction to National Archive sources for local histories. As I said at the beginning of the webinar, it really helps if you can start your research into local history with some parameters in mind. Keep it as geographically specific as you can. Limit your research to a distinct time period if you possibly can, at least to begin with, and have a theme to direct your research. I wish you all the very best of luck with your projects, and thank you for your time and attention.